The barometric pressure began its nosedive at 1432 local time. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS L Bass. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS as BS as BS as BS as. By Kara timely information top years and the news for process had century Dr. Risk Daniels. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS as BS as BS as. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS as BS as. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS as BS as. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS as BS as BS as. Dr. Seshmi Jews as BS as. Dr. Lena Petrova watched the numbers on her screen plummet with a clinical detachment that belied the unease coiling in her gut. A drop of 24 millibars in under an hour was not just unusual for the Alaskan interior, it was, according to all meteorological models, impossible. Her skepticism, a tool honed by years of parsing government climate reports that always seemed to omit inconvenient data, shifted into high gear. This was no natural phenomenon. Outside the reinforced windows of the Fairbanks University Atmospheric Sciences Lab, the sky curdled from a pale afternoon blue to a bruised, greenish black. The first gust of wind hit the building like a physical blow, rattling the panes. Lena's eyes remained fixed on her instruments, her mind racing through variables and dismissing each one. This wasn't a storm. It was an atmospheric seizure. Her magnetometer array, usually a study in gentle, predictable waves, was spiking erratically, indicating massive, localized electromagnetic disturbances. Simultaneously, her Schumann resonance monitor, which tracked the planet's natural electromagnetic heartbeat, displayed a frantic, jagged pattern completely divorced from its usual rhythm. The data was screaming that the fundamental rules of the atmosphere were being rewritten in real time over a precise 50-square-mile area to the northeast, toward Gakona. She pulled up the public radar feed. The supercell was a tightly wound multi-vortex nightmare, a pinwheel of destruction that seemed to defy the laws of fluid dynamics. It wasn't moving with the jet stream, it was practically stationary, pulsing with an unnatural energy, pale the size of golf balls, glowing with an odd ionized sheen in the radar's differential reflectivity data, began to pound the earth. Reports flickered across her emergency band power lines down, roofs torn away, the small town of Tok being systematically dismantled. During a brief, violent lull in the wind, the clouds parted for a moment. To the east, silhouetted against the eerie, storm-lit horizon, she could just make out the distinct geometric pattern of the HAARP antenna array. A silent, sprawling field of metal spines. Local rumors whispered about that place, dismissed as conspiracy theory by her colleagues. She'd always found the official explanations, ionospheric research for improving communications, too neat, too sanitized. Now, watching the data paint a picture of engineered chaos, those rumors didn't seem so foolish. The storm was a tragedy. The readings were a confession. The encrypted email arrived 3 days after the storm, a ghost in the machine. It bypassed her university's standard filters, appearing in a secured secondary inbox she used for collaborative research with other skeptics of the official climate narrative. The subject line was blank. The sender's address was a jumble of alphanumeric characters that resolved to nothing. Lena's first instinct was caution, a reflex born from her work. She isolated the message in a virtual sandbox before opening it. The body of the text was brief, written in a terse, technical prose that immediately commanded her attention. It was not the rambling of a conspiracy theorist. It was the clinical report of an engineer. Dr. Petrova, your analysis of the Tok event was noted. The public-facing mission of this facility is a facade. Our primary research has shifted from passive ionospheric heating to active tropospheric manipulation. The Tok event was a field test of high-power, phased-array beam steering for localized atmospheric destabilization. Parameters: 3.39 MHz carrier wave, 100% AM modulation, ELF modulation at 2.5 Hz for resonant coupling. Power output exceeded publicly stated limits by an order of magnitude. The official mission data is scrubbed. Look for the raw diagnostic logs, if any, remain. They are conducting non-ionospheric experiments. They are not just studying the weather anymore. You are one of the few who would recognize the signature. Investigate, but be discreet. They monitor all external interest. A friend Lena sat back, the hum of her computer the only sound in the quiet lab. Her professional curiosity was instantly, violently engaged. The jargon was authentic ELF modulation, phased array steering. These were the precise, esoteric tools that could, in theory, nudge a stable atmosphere into chaos. The frequency mentioned, 2.5 Hz, was a known Schumann resonance harmonic. It wasn't just plausible. It was terrifyingly specific. Yet, beneath the scientist's thrill at a new, monstrous puzzle, a cold knot of personal unease tightened in her stomach. Your analysis was noted. It meant her own secure systems were not as secure as she believed. Her skepticism, her quiet digging into anomalous events over the years, had painted a target on her back without her knowing it. This wasn't an invitation to discovery. It was a warning passed from inside a fortress. Someone inside HAARP knew what they were doing was wrong, and they knew she was one of the few people on the outside who might be able to prove it. The quiet of the lab no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the silence before a detonation. The reply came 12 hours later, a set of coordinates and a time midnight 2 nights hence at a pull-off on the old Richardson Highway overlooking the Tanana River. The instructions were clear: come alone, no electronic devices, and watch for a single headlight flash. The sender signed it simply, Mark. Lena spent the intervening hours in a state of heightened analytical focus, her mind partitioning the risk into manageable variables. She mapped the route, noting alternative paths and potential observation points. She prepared a disposable, analog contingency, a handwritten note of the meeting's core details sealed in an envelope, left in a colleague's mailbox with a request to open it only if she failed to return. It felt melodramatic, but the clinical tone of Mark's email and the unnatural precision of the storm's data had eradicated any sense of melodrama. This was a calculation of probabilities. The night was clear and bittingly cold, the kind of cold that made the stars look sharp enough to cut. She parked her personal truck a mile from the coordinates and covered this remaining distance on foot, her boots crunching on the frozen gravel of the roadside. The pull-off was deserted, just a small clearing overlooking the dark, silent ribbon of the river. She positioned herself in the tree line, using the dense black spruce for cover, and waited. Her breath plumed in the air, each exhale a tiny cloud of condensation. At exactly midnight, a single headlight flashed once from the road below, a brief, stark signal. A beat-up sedan she didn't recognize rolled to a stop. A man's silhouette got out, his posture tense. This was Martin, but before he could take a second step, the night erupted. 2 black SUVs with no license plates tore out of the darkness from either direction, tires screeching on the asphalt, boxing in the sedan. Doors flew open. Men in dark, unmarked tactical gear swarmed the vehicle. There was no shouting, just the efficient, brutal silence of a professional extraction. Lena's blood went cold. Her instincts, honed by years of assessing dangerous weather systems, screamed at her to abort. This was not a variable she had miscalculated. It was a systemic failure. They hadn't just been monitoring her, they had been inside the communication, looped from the start. The meeting was a trap, or Mark had been compromised the moment he reached out. She didn't wait to see the outcome. Melting back into the shadows, she moved parallel to the road, keeping to the uneven, frozen ground to mask her footsteps. A quarter-mile down, the faint glow of a 24-hour truck stop diner emerged. She broke from the tree line, quickened her pace to a purposeful walk, and pushed through the doors into the warm, greasy air and the low murmur of late-night patrons. She slid into a booth by the window, her back to the wall, and ordered a coffee she had no intention of drinking. Through the glass, she watched one of the black SUVs speed past, followed a minute later by the other. They weren't searching the area. They had what they came for. Mark was gone, the coffee cup trembled in her hand. This wasn't just about protecting secrets anymore. It was about active, dangerous suppression. The stakes had just been violently recalibrated from theoretical to mortal. Back in the sterile safety of her campus office, the adrenaline from the highway faded, replaced by a cold, methodical fury. Mark's capture wasn't a setback, it was a confirmation. They were afraid of what he knew, and by extension, what she might learn. Her skepticism, once a professional tool, was now her only armor. She locked the door, disconnected her computer from the university network, and dove into the digital deep. She started not with the wild-eyed forums, but with the dry, bureaucratic record. The HAARP program had produced volumes of publicly available research, most of it dense with the benign jargon of ionospheric heating and radio propagation studies. But Lena read them like a detective scanning a suspect's alibi for inconsistencies. Buried in a 1998 technical report was a fleeting reference to nonlinear interactions and atmospheric resonance effects that could, under specific high-power conditions, theoretically influence tropospheric weather patterns. The language was cautious, almost dismissive, but it was there a seed of possibility planted decades ago. She cross-referenced these published active periods with global meteorological databases. The correlations were not proof, But the pattern was unsettling. A series of bizarre, persistent high-pressure systems over the Australian outback in 2002 coincided exactly with a documented 2-week HAARP campaign, resulting in a drought that crippled the wheat belt. In 2005, a hurricane forecast to make landfall in Florida had abruptly veered out to sea after exhibiting strange spiral band intensification. HAARP's logs showed a 72-hour period of high-frequency experimentation, ending just hours before the storm's sudden deflection. She moved next to the darker corners of the internet, the conspiracy forums where amateurs and obsessives traded theories. She dismissed the wilder claims mind control, alien communication, but sifted through the digital chaff with a scientist's eye. One user, posting under the handle Skywatcher, had compiled a startlingly precise timeline linking HAARP's rumored high-power tests to localized seismic events and freak lightning storms across the Pacific Northwest. The data was raw and unverified, but the timestamps were exact, and the meteorological anomalies were documented in official, if obscure, Weather Service advisories. Another thread, discussing the implications of the Environmental Modification Convention, ENCOA treaty, debated whether weather control constituted a weapon of mass destruction. The legal arguments were speculative, but the underlying fear was palpable. Lena compiled her findings not as conclusions, but as a series of escalating hypotheses. A 1994 experiment in Alaska was followed by a week of unseasonal, violent thunderstorms in central Russia. A 2010 test run preceded a catastrophic hail event in Croatia that shredded vineyards with ice stones of unnatural density and hardness. Each event, on its own, could be written off as a tragic fluke of nature. But together, arranged along a timeline of HAARP's operational history, they formed a constellation of catastrophe. It was a pattern of chaos, a signature written in storm clouds and seismic tremors. Tensegrators, tens. The rabbit hole didn't lead to a wonderland. It led to a laboratory, and the world was its test subject. The silence of her office was now filled with the ghostly echo of manipulated weather systems, a history of disasters waiting for someone to connect the dots. The flight into Gakona felt less like travel and more like a descent into a different reality. From the window of the small charter plane, the Alaskan interior unfolded in a vast, silent tapestry of spruce forests and rolling tundra, a landscape so immense it seemed to swallow sound and ambition whole. Lena's skepticism, now a hardened, ever-present lens, scanned the terrain not for its beauty but for its strategic isolation. This was a place where things could be hidden in plain sight, secrets buried under the sheer weight of emptiness. The town itself was a sparse collection of buildings clinging to the road, dwarfed by the surrounding wilderness. She checked into a nondescript motel under a research grant cover story, her credentials as a meteorologist studying anomalous atmospheric refraction patterns providing a thin veneer of legitimacy. It was flimsy, but it was all she had. The next morning, under a sky the color of dull slate, she drove the final few miles toward the HAARP site. The facility announced itself, not with a sign, but with a sudden imposing geometry. There, in a clearing carved from the boreal forest, stood the array, 180 antennas arranged in a grid across 33 acres, a forest of white metal spines rising from the permafrost. In the stark, flat light, it looked less like a scientific instrument and more like a silent, waiting army. She parked her rented SUV on a remote access road, a mile from the perimeter fence, using a stand of dense black spruce as cover. Setting up her tripod and a long-range telephoto lens, she began her observation. The clinical, documentary part of her mind noted the details, the sheer scale of the operation, the immaculate maintenance of the grounds. But it was the other details that tightened, the knot in her stomach. There were no overt signs of military presence, no guards patrolling the fence line with rifles. The security was subtler, more insidious. She spotted the sleek, silent shapes of drones tracing pre-programmed flight paths high above the array. At regular intervals along the fence, she noted the faint glint of glass from motion sensors and the compact housings of pan-tilt zoom cameras, their lenses sweeping the perimeter with machine-like patience. It was a sterile, automated vigilance designed to detect and deter without a single human ever needing to be present. She switched from her camera to her field equipment, powering up a portable spectrum analyzer and a high-sensitivity magnetometer. The readings were immediately profoundly wrong. The baseline electromagnetic noise of the environment, usually a gentle hum, was a distorted crackle of interference. Her GPS unit, which had been flawless on the drive-in, began to drift, placing her location randomly within a 100-yard radius. When she tried to record a simple audio memo into her digital recorder, her own voice played back warped and fragmented. as if filtered through thick, static-charged water. This wasn't random atmospheric disturbance. It was targeted, localized EM shielding, a dome of electronic silence thrown over the facility to blind prying eyes and deafen eavesdropping ears. They weren't just hiding their work behind fences and drones. They were hiding it behind a wall of manufactured static. The silence of the wilderness was alive. The air itself was screaming. The interference was a problem, but not an insurmountable one. It confirmed the facility's defensive posture, its desire to operate in a bubble of electronic isolation. Lena's own equipment was compromised, but she had anticipated the possibility of ground-level blindness. Before leaving Fairbanks, she had reached out to a trusted contact at the University of Alaska's Satellite Remote Sensing Lab, a former colleague who shared her unease about the gaps in official climate data. Under the guise of needing high-resolution atmospheric data for a paper on Arctic amplification, she'd secured temporary read-only access to a near real-time satellite feed monitoring electromagnetic emissions across the North Pacific. Back in her motel room, the curtains drawn tight against the endless Alaskan twilight, she booted up her heavily encrypted laptop and logged into the remote portal. The interface was complex, a mosaic of data streams showing everything from ocean surface temperatures to upper atmospheric conductivity. She filtered the view, focusing the satellite's powerful sensors on a precise coordinate, the HAARP array. For hours, the data was a study in benign activity. The facility's output registered as a low, steady hum, consistent with its public-facing mission of ionospheric research background noise in the grand spectrum of planetary energy. Lena's focus never wavered. She cross-referenced the feed with global meteorological databases running on a second screen, her eyes scanning for anomalies. She was looking for a signature, a spike that couldn't be explained by solar flares or geomagnetic storms. It came at 3:17 UTC. On the satellite feed, the energy output from the HAARP coordinates didn't just increase, it erupted. A massive, focused surge lit up the display, peaking at a transmitted power level she calculated to be in the high gigawatt range. The frequency was a tightly controlled burst in the high-frequency band, but modulated with an extremely low-frequency waveform, a combination designed for deep atmospheric penetration. The surge lasted for exactly 18 minutes before cutting off abruptly, returning to its previous dormant state. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the global weather telemetry from the exact same timestamp. She isolated the region most likely to be affected by a high-power transmission from that specific location and angle. Her breath caught in her throat. Siberia, the town of Verkhoyansk, one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth, was experiencing a freak and unprecedented heat wave. The satellite's infrared sensors showed a blistering thermal anomaly centered precisely on the town. Temperature graphs, pulled from weather stations she knew to be reliable, showed a spike of over 20 degrees Celsius in under an hour, shattering all historical records. The timing was not merely coincidental. It was locked in perfect, horrifying sync. The HAARP surge had begun and ended within minutes of the temperature's unnatural rise and fall. Lena leaned back, the glow of the screens reflecting in her wide eyes. The correlation was too precise, too mathematically elegant to be ignored. It was a controlled experiment on a continental scale, a demonstration of power written in the language of energy and temperature. They hadn't just created a storm in Alaska. They could bake a frozen wasteland on the other side of the world. The proof was no longer a pattern in historical data or a whisper from a doomed technician. It was real-time, undeniable, and happening now. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic, the walls closing in as the scale of the truth revealed itself. This wasn't a research facility. It was a weapon, and someone had just pulled the trigger. The message arrived 3 days after the Siberia event, a ghost in the machine's most secure layer. It bypassed every firewall, appearing not as an email, but as a text file generated within an isolated, air-gapped decryption program Lena used for the most sensitive satellite data. The method was ingenious, a data packet hidden within a routine telemetry update, stowaway in a stream of numbers. It contained no greeting, only a set of coordinates for a dead drop, a specific hollow at the base of a lightning-blasted spruce 10 miles from the facility, and a time 040 the next morning. It was signed with a single, stark letter, A. Lena's analytical mind, honed by years of assessing risk in volatile systems, immediately began modeling the probabilities. A trap was the overwhelming likelihood. Yet, the sophistication of the delivery method spoke of a deep, internal access that an outside provocateur wouldn't possess. It felt like the work of someone who knew the facility's digital heartbeat intimately. She made her decision based on a cold calculus. The potential intelligence value outweighed the personal risk. The proof from Siberia demanded it. She approached the drop site 2 hours early, using the deep, moonless Arctic night as her primary cover. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through her layers of insulation. She settled into a shallow depression 50 yards from the designated tree, her body still, her senses stretched to their limits. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind through the spruce boughs and the distant, lonely cry of a fox. At precisely 0400, a figure emerged from the gloom, moving with the hesitant, quiet steps of a man not accustomed to the wilderness. He was tall, thin, wrapped in a dark parka, his face obscured by a hood and a scarf. He didn't look around. He went straight to the tree, knelt, and placed a small, wrapped bundle into the hollow. He paused for a moment, his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound exhaustion or despair, then turned and melted back into the forest the way he had come. Lena waited another 30 minutes, the cold gnawing at her extremities before moving. The bundle was a waterproof pouch. Inside was a cheap, disposable burner phone, its battery fully charged, and a single slip of paper with a 12-digit number. No other instructions. She retreated to her vehicle, parked a mile away, and drove for another 20 minutes before powering the phone on. It connected to a satellite network, not a local cell tower. A moment later, it vibrated with an incoming text from an unknown number. Dr. Petrova. We don't have long. They audit all outbound data packets, even the hidden ones. They will find the anomaly soon. Lena's fingers were stiff with cold, but she typed quickly. Who are you? Dr. Aris Thorne, Senior Project Physicist, Ionospheric and Tropospheric Studies Division. I was on shift for the Toka vent, and for Siberia. The admission was like a physical blow. Lena forced herself to remain clinical, the beam steering, the ELF modulation. It was in the initial warning. Mark was a good man, a technician. He only saw fragments. I see the whole monstrous picture. The texts came in rapid, staccato bursts, the digital equivalent of a hushed, frantic confession. We were sold a lie. A noble lie advanced atmospheric science for the betterment of humanity. Ionospheric research to protect communications, to understand climate change. I believed it. We all did. What changed? Lena typed the directive 5 years ago. The focus shifted from study to application, from observation to control. The math is the same, but the intent is a perversion. The next message took longer to arrive, as if the man on the other end was struggling to form the words. We've moved beyond ionospheric heating. We are now engaged in active tropospheric manipulation using phased array steering of high-power microwave transmissions. So, we can induce static stability layers, disrupt jet stream patterns, create targeted thermodynamic imbalances. Talk was a stability disruption test. Siberia was a thermal forcing demonstration. We don't just predict the weather anymore, Dr. Petrova. We author it. Lena stared at the screen, the words etching themselves into her mind. The clinical terminology made the confession more horrifying, not less. This wasn't a rant, it was a peer-reviewed admission of guilt. Why are you telling me this? She asked. The reply was immediate and soaked in a palpable, weary anguish. Because I helped build the weapon. I need someone to know what we have done, what we are capable of, before they ask us to do it again. The phone went dead. No final message. Just the empty glow of the screen in the dark cab of the truck. Lena sat in the silence, the weight of Thorne's words pressing down on her. The mystery had solidified into a terrible, confirmed truth. She was no longer chasing a ghost. She was holding a confession from the machine's very heart. The dead drop this time was a different tree, a gnarled white spruce leaning precariously over a frozen creek bed 5 miles further from the facility. The instructions, delivered via a one-time pad cipher on the burner phone, were even more precise. A 3-minute retrieval window exactly at noon, when a scheduled maintenance drone flyover would create a predictable blind spot in the visual surveillance. Lena executed the maneuver with the cold precision of a field researcher collecting a volatile core sample. In, grab, out. The package was heavier than the last. A ruggedized, fingerprint-smudged external hard drive sealed in a static shielding bag. Back in the motel room, her heart hammered against her ribs. She connected it to her isolated laptop. The drive contained a single directory, labeled simply log_RI. Inside were hundreds of files, each with a complex alphanumeric naming convention. but it was the contents that stole the air from the room. They were raw diagnostic logs from the HHA control systems, time-stamped, unscrubbed, and terrifyingly detailed. She opened the file, tagged with the date of the Alaskan superstorm. The data was a symphony of destruction written in machine code. Timestamps marched down the left column. Each minute correlated to a specific command. Power output levels, usually measured in kilowatts for public research, were logged in the gigawatt range. Frequency modulation schemes were listed, showing a deliberate shift from standard high-frequency ionospheric heating to a complex, pulsed, extremely low-frequency ELF wavefronts, designed for deep tropospheric penetration. She cross-referenced the log's commands with her own recorded data from the storm. The correlation was absolute. At 1432, the log showed a command to initiate test sequence Delta. Her own instruments had recorded the barometric pressure's catastrophic plunge at 1432. The log detailed a 15-minute burst of multi-phase beam steering to create a rotating column of energized atmosphere. The radar had shown the multi-vortex structure forming at exactly that time. It was a direct, irrefutable causal chain. The storm hadn't been an act of God, it had been a scheduled test. Her hands trembling slightly, she opened other files. A log from 6 months prior detailed a week-long drought induction protocol targeting the specific watershed in Western Australia. She pulled up international meteorological reports. The region had suffered its worst dry spell in a century, crippling agriculture. Another file from the previous hurricane season outlined a cyclonic steering effort using precisely timed energy pulses to nudge a Category 4 storm away from the U.S. coastline and into a shipping lane, where it devastated a fleet of cargo vessels. An act framed as a miracle of missed landfall was, in reality, a calculated act of geopolitical sabotage disguised as benevolence. Lena leaned back, the glow of the screen illuminating her face, which was a mask of triumph and profound horror. She had it. Not a theory, not a pattern of correlations, but the raw, technical proof. The data logs were the facility's own unedited diary, and every entry was a confession to a crime against nature itself. The triumph of discovery was instantly hollowed out by the chilling scope of the reality. This wasn't a single rogue experiment. It was a program. A systematic, ongoing campaign to weaponize the very sky. She had the truth, and the truth was infinitely more monstrous than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. The motel room was a tomb of silent data. The only light, the pale blue glow of the laptop screen. Lena's fingers flew across the keyboard, her movements efficient, driven by a cold, focused urgency. The external drive was a lead weight in her pocket, its contents a universe of damning truth. She couldn't keep it here. The transfer to a secure, encrypted cloud blocker, a digital dead drop she'd set up years prior for sensitive research, was her only play. It was a calculated risk, a brief window of vulnerability she had to accept. The progress bar on the screen crept toward completion. 95%, 96%. Her eyes flicked to the window, to the empty parking lot shrouded in the deep indigo of the Alaskan night. The silence felt heavy, charged. 97%, a sudden, sharp crack from the parking lot, the sound of gravel under aggressive tires, not the gentle roll of a tourist's car. Her head snapped up. Through the slats of the blinds, she saw the dark shapes of two large vehicles, Sol, Utes, black, no marking sliding to a halt, blocking her truck. Doors opened silently. Figures emerged, moving with a coordinated, predatory grace. They weren't local police. Their gear was tactical, professional, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They fanned out without a word, two moving toward her door, others covering the exits. Network monitoring. They detected the data packet's anomalous signature leaving the local grid. The thought was a bolt of ice through her veins. The transfer was at 98%. There was no time for panic, only procedure. She yanked the drive from the laptop, the cable snapping taut before giving way. The machine chimed transfer complete. A tiny victory swallowed by the immediate threat. She shoved the drive into the inner pocket of her jacket, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against it. A heavy fist pounded on the door. Once, a demand, not a request. Open up, security. Lena's eyes scanned the room. The front door was the only conventional exit. The window was her only chance. She grabbed the heavy ceramic lamp from the nightstand, and in one fluid motion, she yanked its cord from the wall and hurled it through the window pane. Glass exploded outward in a cascade of glittering shards. The pounding on the door turned to a violent crash as a ram took out the lock. She didn't look back. Launching herself through the jagged opening, she landed hard on the frozen ground outside, the impact jarring her knees. Shouts erupted behind her. A flashlight beam swept over her, blinding her for a split second. Think. Use the environment. Her mind, trained to model complex systems, processed her options with desperate speed. To her left was the main road, likely covered. To her right, behind the motel, was a dense thicket of alder and spruce. And beyond that, the vast, dark unknown of the wilderness. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not for the road, but for the tree line, angling toward the motel's rear where a rusted dumpster offered a moment of cover. As she passed a red metal box on the wall, she didn't break stride. Her arm shot out, fingers hooking under the handle of the fire alarm, and pulled. The shriek was instantaneous, deafening, a primal scream that tore through the night. Lights flicked on in other rooms. Doors opened, confused voices adding to the chaos. It was the diversion she needed. She plunged into the woods, the brittle branches, whipping at her face and hands, the darkness swallowing her whole. The shouts of her pursuers were muffled by the alarm and the thick forest. She ran, her breath ragged plumes in the frigid air, driven by a single terrifying thought. She was no longer an investigator. The proof in her pocket had transformed her into a fugitive, and the wilderness was her only ally. The forest was a black labyrinth, every snapping twig a potential alarm. Lena pushed deeper, her lungs burning with the cold, thin air. Behind her, the shriek of the fire alarm faded, replaced by the more immediate sounds of pursuit, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the low, tense commands exchanged over radios. They were professionals, moving with a grim efficiency that spoke of training and intent. They weren't here to detain, they were here to erase. Her mind, a whirlwind of adrenaline, began to impose order on the chaos. She was a meteorologist, not a soldier. Her weapon was knowledge. She forced herself to stop behind the thick, gnarled trunk of an ancient spruce, pressing her body against the rough bark. She closed her eyes, not to pray, but to listen and to calculate. The wind. It was a constant, whispering presence. She focused on its direction and speed, feeling its subtle shift against her cheek. It was a northwesterly flow, about 10 knots, standard for the season. But as she concentrated, her trained senses picked up an anomaly. The air was cooling at a rate that defied the standard adiabatic lapse rate. It was too rapid, too localized. The moisture content, measured by the feel of the air against her skin and the faint hint of condensation on her eyelashes, was spiking without a corresponding drop in barometric pressure. This wasn't natural radiative cooling. This was forced condensation. A memory surfaced, cold and clear. A line from Eris's data logs. Protocol 7D, rapid tropospheric saturation via targeted microwave heating of atmospheric water vapor. They could flash heat pockets of humid air, causing instantaneous, massive condensation. Fog. They were manufacturing a blanket to blind her. The pursuit was closing in. A beam of light swept the trees 20 yards to her left. She had to move, but instead of running blindly, she used the wind. She angled her path perpendicular to the flow, knowing the unnatural fog would be carried downwind, its leading edge, spreading like a silent tide. She needed to stay ahead of it, to use its impending cover without being swallowed by it and disoriented. She moved in a low crouch, her progress agonizingly slow but silent. The first tendrils of mist began to curl around the base of the trees, ethereal and ghostly in the faint starlight. It thickened with shocking speed, a wall of white advancing through the forest, swallowing sound and reducing visibility to mere feet. The shouts of her pursuers changed tone, shifting from determined to frustrated. Their flashlight beams, once piercing lances, became diffuse, useless globes of light in the swirling murk. Their coordinated search broke down into confused, isolated calls. Lena found a depression in the land, a shallow runoff ditch mostly filled with frozen leaves. She slid into it, pulling a mat of old, damp ferns over herself, becoming just another shadow in the fog-shrouded landscape. She lay perfectly still, controlling her breathing, making herself a part of the cold, wet earth. Boots crunched past, so close she could smell the faint scent of coffee on the man's breath. He paused, sweeping his light blindly over the ditch. The beam passed over the ferns, covering her head, illuminating the world in a brief, terrifying white glow before moving on. His radio crackled. Nothing on this flank. Visibility is 0. The damn fog came out of nowhere. Not nowhere, Lena thought. Her face pressed into the frozen leaves. From a console in a warm room. Her knowledge had turned their weapon into her shield. The very technology they used to hunt her was now protecting her. she stayed hidden, listening as the search lost its cohesion and eventually its will, the sounds of the men fading as they retreated back toward the cleared land, defeated by the artificial weather. The fog clung to the forest, a cold, silent ally. She was alone, but she was free, for now. The fog was her shroud for 3 hours. Lena remained motionless in the ditch until the unnatural mist began to thin. Its purpose spent, the cold had seeped into her bones, a deep aching numbness that was a small price to pay for survival. When the forest was once again just a dark, quiet forest, she moved, her body protesting every stiff, frozen motion. Her first priority was distance. She put 5 miles between herself and the motel, navigating by the faint glow of the aurora borealis and the steady direction of the North Star, her mind automatically correcting for magnetic declination. Her second priority was communication. The drive in her pocket was a bomb. It needed to be in the hands of someone who could detonate it in the public square. She had one card left to play: Elias Vance, an independent investigative journalist she'd met years ago at a conference on scientific ethics in the age of disinformation. He ran a small, scrappy, but fiercely credible online outlet that specialized in holding power to account. They had traded contact information for a secure, encrypted messaging app, a professional courtesy between two people who understood the value of off-grid channels. At dawn, shivering in the lee of a rocky outcrop that blocked the worst of the wind, she powered on the burner phone Aris had provided. The battery was low, but it had 1 bar of satellite signal. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, typed a brief, coded message to Elias's secure handle. Elias, it's Lena Petrova. Package secured. Need immediate, secure handoff. Public interest is extreme. Confirm receipt. The reply was almost instantaneous. Lena, signal confirmed. Standing by. Use Streamcast Protocol Channel 7. Encryption key, Aurora. We are live in 90 minutes. Can you make the window? 90 minutes. She looked at the dying phone, the vast, empty landscape around her, and the drive containing the fate of the world in her pocket. It was an impossible ask. It was the only ask. Affirmative, she typed back. Will transmit. She spent the next hour moving toward higher ground, seeking a clear line of sight to the sky for the satellite uplink. She found a windswept ridge with a sparse covering of stunted trees. The setup was frantic, her hands shaking. She connected the external drive to the phone via a compact adapter, her body shielding the devices from the biting wind. She loaded the encryption software, entered the key Aurora, and queued the most damning files for transfer of the logs from the Alaskan storm and the Siberian heatwave. The connection was agonizingly slow, the satellite link fighting the residual EM interference that still seemed to cling to the air around Bacona. With 10 minutes to spare, the transfer status read ready to stream. Elias's voice, calm and professional, came through a tiny crackling earpiece she plugged into the phone. Lena, we are live in 5. Audio only for your safety. I will narrate the documents as they come in. Just get them to us. She could hear the low hum of a newsroom in the background, the sound of a team ready for a war they didn't fully understand yet. I'm ready, she whispered, her voice raw. Stand by, and we're live in 3, 2. A tone sounded in her ear, signaling the start of the broadcast. On the other end, she knew Elias was beginning his introduction, his voice now reaching a scattered but global audience of truth seekers and skeptics. Go, Elias's voice said in her ear, the command quiet but firm. Lena pressed the command to initiate the data stream. The progress bar began its crawl. For a glorious, heart-stopping 30 seconds, it worked. She could imagine the files, the cold, hard proof of weaponized weather flashing onto screens across the world. Then the signal died. It didn't fade or break up. It was severed. One moment, the progress bar was moving. The next, the phone screen flashed no signals and went dark. A wave of pure, targeted electromagnetic noise washed over the ridge, so powerful she could feel it as a pressure in her teeth. The devices weren't just disconnected. They were fried, their circuits overloaded by a focused burst of energy from the direction of the facility. In her ear, Elias's voice cut out mid-sentence, replaced by a burst of deafening digital static that made her yank the earpiece out. Then, silence. They hadn't just found the transmission. They had surgically killed it with a scalpel made of radio waves. The world hadn't seen the proof. They'd seen a broadcast fail mysteriously. They'd heard a journalist's voice cut off. To some, it would be evidence of suppression. To most, it would look like the kind of technical glitch that always seemed to plague conspiracy theorists. The credibility of the revelation now hung in the balance. A ghost of a story, half told and easily dismissed. Lena stared at the dead phone in her hand, the victory of the past days turning to ash. The truth was out, but it had been crippled, left to limp into the world as just another unverifiable myth. The abandoned weather station was a skeleton of its former self, a collection of rusted instruments and peeling paint hunkered on a wind-scoured ridge. Lena had chosen it for its isolation and its single, defensible entrance, but as the black SUVs skidded to a halt outside, churning up gravel, it felt less like a refuge and more like a trap she had walked into. The drive was a cold, hard weight against her ribs, its data now feeling more like a death sentence than a revelation. The door, already hanging loose on one hinge, was pushed open not with a kick, but with a calm, deliberate motion. The man who stepped through was not what she expected. He wasn't dressed in tactical gear, but in a dark, expensive-looking wool overcoat over a suit. He was in his late 50s, with a closely trimmed gray beard and the tired, pragmatic eyes of a senior administrator, not a soldier. This was the security director. He carried no weapon. His authority was his presence. "Dr. Petrova," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, though it carried easily in the metallic silence of the station. "You've led us on quite a chase. Costly. Inefficient." Lena remained still, her back against a bank of dead control panels. Her eyes scanned the room, cataloging exits that weren't there, potential weapons that didn't exist. Her mind, however, was preternaturally calm, analyzing him as she would a complex weather system. His posture was relaxed, his hands visible. This was not an assault. It was a negotiation. "We can stop this now," he continued, taking a single step further into the room. The wind howled outside, a constant, eerie accompaniment to his words. The theatrics, the running. "It's beneath a woman of your talents. What do you want?" Lena asked, her own voice steady, clinical. She would not give him the satisfaction of fear. "What we've always wanted. The responsible application of a profound technology. You've seen the logs, you understand the scope. You know it's not a myth." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the unseen facility. "You also know the world isn't ready for that truth. The panic, the geopolitical instability it would cause. It would be a disaster far greater than any single storm we could ever generate." He took another step, now close enough that she could see the fine lines of stress around his eyes. "This doesn't have to end with you in a shallow grave or wasting away in a black site. That's a terrible waste of a brilliant mind. There's another option." He paused, letting the offer hang in the cold air between them. The station creaked around them. "Assimilation," he said. The word clinical, clean. "Join the program. Your skepticism, your dogged pursuit of truth, these are assets. We need people who ask the hard questions, who can stress test our models from the inside. You'd be privy to everything, the full picture. You could help steer this power, ensure it's used judiciously." He made it sound reasonable, noble, even. A call to serve for the greater good. It was the most dangerous offer she had ever received. "Your alternative is silence," he said, his tone hardening just a fraction, the administrator giving way to the enforcer. "Permanent, absolute silence. The data dies with you, and the world remains blissfully, safely ignorant. It's a simple choice, Doctor. Help us manage the truth or be erased by it." The wind shrieked against the corrugated metal roof, a sound of pure desolation. Lena looked at him, at the pragmatic certainty in his face. He truly believed he was offering her salvation. He saw her not as an enemy, but as a rogue asset to be reacquired. Her moral core, the very integrity that had driven her this far, solidified into something cold and unyielding. She would not help them manage their monstrosity. She would not sanitize their weapon. "Judiciously," she finally said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the wind's moan. "You don't get to make that choice. No one does." The director's placid expression didn't change, but a flicker of disappointment, or perhaps resignation, passed through his eyes. He had his answer. The negotiation was over. Lena's refusal hung in the frigid air, a line drawn in the permafrost. The security director's face, a mask of pragmatic reason, finally cracked. The disappointment solidified into a cold, operational resolve. He didn't signal his men outside with a shout. He simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The standoff ended. The door burst open, and two figures in tactical gear surged into the cramped space, weapons raised. The director took a step back, his part in the drama over. He was the architect of the offer, not its enforcer. Lena's mind, operating on pure analytical instinct, had already processed the room's single desperate variable, the antiquated electrical panel mounted on the wall behind her, its frayed wiring snaking into the ceiling. It was a relic, bypassed long ago, but it still drew a live feed from a weather-beaten external line, a power source, a potential catalyst. But before she could move, a new sound cut through the tension, not from outside, but from the old, dust-choked VHF radio unit on a nearby desk. It crackled to life with a burst of static, then a voice, strained and desperate. "Lena, run, now." Primary capacitor bank overload sequence initiated. The voice was cut off by a wet, choking sound and a scuffle, but the message was delivered. Eris. The two advancing security men hesitated, confused by the sudden broadcast. The director's head whipped toward the radio, his composure finally shattered. Thorn? How did he never finished the question. From the direction of the ARP facility, a deep subsonic thrum vibrated through the very rock of the ridge, a feeling more than a sound. It was followed a second later by a deafening crump that shook the station to its foundations. A flash of actinic blue-white light, brighter than the sun, lit up the world beyond the grimy windows for a split second before dying away. Eris's diversion. He hadn't just sent a warning. He triggered a catastrophic overload in the facility's main power system. A sacrifice play to create chaos. The effect was instantaneous. Every light in the station, the dead control panels, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flared with impossible brilliance and then blew out in a shower of sparks and the acrid smell of ozone. The security team's radios erupted into a cacophony of panicked shouts and emergency alarms from the facility. Their attention was violently ripped away from Lena. In the sudden, stunned darkness, lit only by the flickering emergency glow of fried electronics, Lena moved. She didn't go for the door, now blocked by disoriented men. She lunged for the bank of old instrument consoles, her fingers finding the seam of a rusted access panel she'd noted upon her arrival. She yanked it open. Inside, nestled among cobwebs and mouse nests, was not more wiring, but a slim, metal lockbox. It was crude, hidden in the one place no modern electronic sweep would ever look. Eris's final contingency, the dead drop within the dead drop. She hauled it out just as one of the security men recovered, his flashlight beam swinging wildly toward her. She ducked as a bullet splintered the wood where her head had been. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she used the consoles for cover. The metal box clutched to her chest. She reached a shattered window at the rear of the building, the one she'd already identified as her only viable exit. She threw herself through the jagged opening, landing hard on the rocky ground outside. The cold air was a slap, but it was the air of freedom. She didn't look back. She ran, stumbling down the dark slope away from the station, toward the concealing blackness of the tree line. Behind her, the station was a tableau of confusion, backlit by the distant, flickering glow of the facility's self-inflicted wound. Eris had traded his life for a few seconds of chaos and a final piece of the puzzle. The box in her arms was heavy. It wasn't a digital ghost. It was something tangible, real. A hardware key, a manual logbook, something that couldn't be erased with an EMP or discredited as a digital forgery. She plunged into the woods, the sounds of pursuit now disorganized and distant, overwhelmed by the larger crisis. At the facility, she was free for now, but the cost of the proof she carried was etched into her soul, a scar that would never fade. Data had a price, and Eris Thorne had just paid it in full. The story broke in fragments, a digital ghost haunting the edges of the mainstream. Elias Vance, his broadcast crippled but his resolve hardened, published what he had. The transmission had been jammed, but not before a handful of files had made it through. The evidence was compelling but incomplete. Grainy, time-stamped screenshots of control logs showing gigawatt-level transmissions, redacted technical schematics of phased array beam steering. A shaky, enhanced video still of a Siberian thermal anomaly, its borders too precise, too geometric to be natural. The public reaction was a study in polarized modern life. On forums and social media, the story detonated. #weather weapon trended globally. Amateur investigators cross-referenced the leaked timestamps with historical weather disasters, building a damning mosaic of correlation. Protests, small but vocal, materialized outside government buildings, their signs demanding answers and accountability. The phrase HAARP, shed its conspiracy theory skin and entered the mainstream lexicon as a symbol of unchecked technological power. In Washington, the reaction was swifter and more brutal. Official denials were issued within hours, a coordinated barrage from multiple agencies. They employed a precise clinical strategy of discreditation. Lena was painted not as a dedicated scientist, but as an unstable whistleblower with a history of erratic behavior and a grudge against federally funded research. Her meticulous evidence was dismissed as sophisticated digital forgeries, the product of a talented but misguided individual. Alternative explanations were offered for each event. The Alaskan storm was a tragic but documented meteorological anomaly, the Siberia heat wave a result of unprecedented Arctic amplification. They cited national security, refusing to comment on the specifics of defensive research programs, a phrase that implied protection while admitting nothing. Congressional inquiries were launched, but they quickly bogged down in partisan theater. Sympathetic lawmakers demanded public hearings and full transparency, their voices amplified by the outcry. The majority, however, fell in line behind the administration's stance, citing the need to protect vital national security assets and avoid public panic. Witnesses were slow to be called, testimony was heavily redacted, and the proceedings were quickly mired in bureaucratic inertia. The story had sparked a fire, but the official response was a blanket of wet sand, smothering the flames into a bed of simmering doubt and unresolved questions. The truth was out, but it had been successfully framed as a debate, not a fact. The battle was not over, but it had moved from the wilderness of Alaska to the committee rooms of Capitol Hill, where the rules of engagement were far more opaque. The world knew a version of the truth, the ghost story told in fragments and official denials. For Dr. Lena Petrova, the world had shrunk to a single, rented room above a dusty hardware store in a town too small to have a name on most maps. The air smelled of sawdust and damp plaster, a far cry from the crisp, charged atmosphere of her lab. Her new normal was a precarious existence measured in encrypted data packets, dead drops, and the constant, low-grade hum of paranoia. Her window didn't offer a view of the sky she had spent her life studying, but of a brick wall and a rusted fire escape. Her instruments were gone, replaced by a laptop whose operating system she had personally stripped and rebuilt for anonymity, its connection routed through a dizzying series of proxies. Communication with Elias Vance was now limited to pre-written messages uploaded to draft folders on abandoned email accounts, a digital version of passing notes in the dark. She spent her days monitoring, not weather patterns, but the news cycle and the deep, dark web. The public outcry had peaked and then, as she knew it would, begun to recede, diluted by a constant drip of official counter-narratives and the world's short attention span. The congressional inquiries were stalled, lost in a morass of classified briefings and procedural delays. HAARP, the facility, had become a political football, not a crime scene. Her most critical task was watching the facility itself through a patchwork of publicly available satellite imagery, air traffic control feeds, and energy grid monitoring sites. She kept a silent vigil over Gakona. The data was clear, the experiments had paused. The massive energy surges that had scarred the atmosphere were absent. The log files she and Eris had stolen documented a full-stop order issued days after the failed broadcast. The world's most powerful atmospheric weapon was, for the moment, switched off. But the infrastructure remained. The satellite photos showed the 33-acre antenna array standing silent and pristine under the best, shifting Alaskan light, a monument to its own dormant potential. The access roads were still plowed. The security drones still traced their lazy, automated orbits. The power substation hummed with idle capacity. It was a watchful silence, a beast in hibernation. They hadn't dismantled a single antenna. They had merely closed the user manual and locked it in a drawer, waiting for the scrutiny to die down and the right key to turn in the right lock. The silence was the most frightening part. The absence of activity was not an admission of guilt. It was a strategy. It allowed the official story of a misunderstood research facility, of a deluded scientist, of digital forgeries to solidify into accepted fact. The pause was a calculated gamble, but the world would eventually look away. Lena would not look away. From her small room, she watched the silent antennas. On clear nights, she would pull up a public feed of the Aurora Cam from Fairbanks and watch the ghostly lights dance over the continent. The sky was a canvas, and she knew the brushes were still there, cleaned and waiting in their studio. The new normal was a ceasefire, not a peace. It was the quiet of a breath held, not a sigh of relief. The threat hadn't been eliminated. It had simply been postponed, its existence a permanent, silent question mark. hanging over the entire world. The rented room's single window offered a sliver of the vast Alaskan sky, a narrow rectangle of endless blue, or, more often, a sheet of relentless gray. Lina's world had contracted to this space, her life reduced to a collection of routines built around vigilance and silence. The paranoia was a low-grade fever she'd learned to live with, a constant companion that sharpened her senses and narrowed her focus to a single point on the map. Gakona, her days were a cycle of monitoring. She tracked satellite feeds showing the HAARP facility from orbit, a geometric scar on the tundra. She parsed energy consumption reports from the regional grid, noting the steady baseline draw that meant the facility was on life support, not dead. She scanned encrypted channels and the darker corners of the internet, listening for whispers of renewed activity, for the ghost of a frequency spike that would signal the end of the pause. The silence from the array was absolute, a void more unnerving than any storm it could produce. Months had bled into a year. The congressional hearings had concluded with a heavily redacted report that found no evidence of weaponization, while recommending further oversight, a masterpiece of bureaucratic nullification. The public's outrage had cooled, diverted by new crises and scandals. #weather weapon was a forgotten hashtag. She'd done it. She'd forced the monster back into its cave. The battle was over, but the victory felt hollow, a shaky ceasefire negotiated from a position of hiding. The battle was over, but had the war even begun? Or had the true agenda simply folded in on itself, burrowed deeper into the shadows of some black budget, waiting for her and the world to finally look away? The facility's dormancy felt less like a surrender and more like a strategic retreat. They hadn't needed to silence her completely, they'd only needed to outlast the attention span of a distracted planet. One evening, the aurora borealis erupted in a rare, violent display of green and violet, painting the sky in liquid light. Lina pulled up the public live stream from a webcam in Fairbanks. The ethereal waves shimmered and danced, a natural phenomenon of breathtaking beauty. But her trained eye, forever corrupted by what she knew, couldn't see it as just beauty anymore. She saw the ionosphere, a plasma layer ripe for manipulation. She saw a canvas. She saw the dormant antennas of HAARP, silent sentinels waiting beneath the spectacle, capable of painting their own designs upon that canvas if given the command. The proof was safe, scattered across dead drops and encrypted servers, a sword she could never wield again without bringing a world of hurt down upon herself. It existed, a historical record of a crime that had been officially erased. But history had a way of repeating itself, especially when the tools remained sharp and ready. She closed the laptop, the aurora's glow fading from the screen. The room was plunged into a deep quiet, broken only by the hum of the old radiator. The sky, for now, was quiet, but the silence felt like a warning, a held breath, a promise of storms to come. The question wasn't answered. It was merely waiting, patient and eternal, in the frozen ground of Alaska.